Here, in this heavily wooded terrain, Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps would accomplish what conventional wisdom deemed beyond achievement. Guderian exercised direct command over 3 formidable divisions: the 1st Panzer Division under Friedrich Kirchner's leadership, the 2nd Panzer Division commanded by Rudolf Weil, and the 10th Panzer Division directed by Ferdinand Schall. Operating parallel to Guderian's forces, Hermann Hoth's 15th Corps, with Hoth holding the rank of General der Infanterie, pushed forward with 2 additional formations, specifically the 5th Panzer Division and the 7th Panzer Division commanded by an ambitious officer named Erwin Rommel, whose star would rise dramatically. Within a matter of days, Rommel's division would acquire the nickname Ghost Division, earned through its disconcerting habit of materializing in locations where enemy forces least anticipated encountering armored formations. The breakthrough materialized with velocity that astonished even those executing the maneuver. By the 13th of May, Guderian's formations had successfully crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, following a devastating aerial bombardment delivered by Flieger Corps 8 under the command of Wolfram von Richthofen, who happened to be cousin to the legendary Red Baron from the previous war. French defensive positions crumbled under the coordinated assault combining tanks, dive-bombing aircraft, and motorized infantry operating in unprecedented harmony. Hans von Luck, commanding a reconnaissance battalion within Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, would later recall in his memoir titled Panzer Commander that reaching the Meuse in merely 3 days represented a pace of advance that astonished even the German forces themselves. The key to this incredible velocity lay not exclusively in the tanks themselves, but rather in an entirely new conceptualization of warfare's fundamental nature. Forward Luftwaffe liaison officers, equipped with radio communication equipment, possessed the capability to summon dive bomber strikes within 45 minutes. The screaming Junkers 87 aircraft of Sturzkampfgeschwader 2 and St. G-77, their sirens deliberately designed to produce wailing sounds, shattered enemy morale before armoured vehicles even arrived in the combat zone. This represented psychological warfare married to mechanical precision in ways never before witnessed. By the 20th of May, what had seemed impossible just days earlier had become accomplished fact. Armoured spearhead elements from the 2nd Panzer Division reached Noyelles-sur-Mer on the English Channel coast. In the span of merely 10 days, German forces had driven a corridor completely to the sea, effectively cutting Allied armies into 2 separated segments. The speed of this advance had been so rapid that even the Supreme Leader expressed disbelief when receiving reports at his headquarters. Success, however, brought complications of its own. Tank losses through mechanical breakdown and combat action had mounted to alarming levels. Some panzer units submitted reports indicating they had been reduced to 50% operational strength by the 21st of May. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin across hundreds of miles of conquered territory. Infantry divisions struggled desperately to maintain pace with racing armoured formations. Then came the incident at Arras that would shake German confidence. On the 21st of May, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, advancing with the confidence born of uninterrupted success, suddenly found itself subjected to attack by British tank forces at Arras. The impact proved immediate and profoundly shocking to German assumptions. Rommel's official war diary recorded the division's casualties as 89 killed, 116 wounded, and 173 missing, representing more losses than the entire breakthrough to that point had cost. Rommel himself found it necessary to personally direct anti-tank gun positions, later writing in his reports that he personally designated each gun's specific target. The psychological impact rippled upward through German high command structure. Kleist's headquarters developed concerns about exposed flanks vulnerable to similar attacks. Though British forces were eventually beaten off, the attack had planted seeds of doubt in German minds. Were the panzers racing too far ahead of supporting infantry? Were they advancing into some carefully prepared trap? By the 23rd of May, German forces held Boulogne and were actively besieging Calais. The entire British expeditionary force, The French First Army and elements of Belgian forces found themselves compressed into a steadily shrinking pocket with their backs literally against the sea. At German headquarters, the prevailing mood was triumphant. Wehrmacht communiques prepared to announce what they characterized as the greatest annihilation battle in all of military history. On the evening of the 23rd of May in 1940, Gerd von Rundstedt, holding the rank of General Oberst, made a decision whose echoes would reverberate through subsequent history. Concerned about reports arriving from his panzer commanders, given that Kleist had reported tank strength significantly reduced, supply lines dangerously overextended, and the Arras attack had demonstrated Allied capacity for surprise counter-offensive action, Rundstedt issued a preliminary order to halt forward movement. The following morning, the Supreme Leader arrived personally at Rundstedt's headquarters at Charleville-Mézières. According to the diary maintained by Franz Halder, who served as Chief of the General Staff, at 12:42 hours on the 24th of May, the fateful order was transmitted through military channels. By directive of the Führer, the attack northwest of Arras was to be limited to the general line running through Lens, Bethune, Aire, Saint-Omer and Gravelines. The canal system would not be crossed under any circumstances. Halder noted with barely concealed frustration that the Supreme Leader was exhibiting terrible nervousness, appearing afraid to take any chances whatsoever. The Halt order possessed multiple fathers, multiple sources of origin. Rundstedt worried about his vulnerable flanks and wanted infantry formations to catch up with advanced armoured units. The Supreme Leader, haunted by his personal experiences during the First World War in Flanders region, believed the marshy terrain characteristics around Dunkirk rendered it unsuitable for tank operations. Perhaps the most decisive voice, however, came via telephone communication from Hermann Göring. The Reichsmarschall had promised with characteristic bombast that his Luftwaffe would destroy the Dunkirk pocket entirely from above. Why risk precious panzer formations when the Air Force could finish the job through aerial bombardment alone? The impact at frontline positions proved immediate and dramatic. Guderian, whose 19th Panzer Corps sat within literal sight of Dunkirk, reacted with fury to the order. His 1st Panzer Division had already positioned bridging equipment across the AA canal system. Some reconnaissance units had actually crossed to the far bank. Now they received orders to pull back and assume defensive positions instead of exploiting their advantage. For 3 precious days, German soldiers sat idle while the evacuation began to unfold before their very eyes. Through military optical equipment, they observed as an armada began to gather off the French coastline. Destroyers, passenger ferries, fishing boats, private pleasure yachts, essentially anything capable of floating and carrying men, began appearing. Wehrmacht war diaries from frontline units meticulously describe the mounting frustration. The 2nd Panzer Division's engineer units spent the 25th of May constructing bridges over the canal system, preparing for the advance they naturally assumed must surely commence. Artillery units maintained harassing fire on the beaches and port facilities. But the main striking power of the Wehrmacht, its concentrated armoured might, sat completely idle. On the evening of the 26th of May, the Supreme Leader finally rescinded the Halt order. It would require another 16 hours, however, for units to resume their advance. By that juncture, the Allies had gained 4 precious days to organise defensive positions and initiate Operation Dynamo in earnest. When German forces finally moved forward on the 27th of May, they encountered organised resistance instead of the chaos and confusion they had anticipated encountering. Hermann Göring's confident assurance to the Supreme Leader that his Luftwaffe would destroy the Allied pocket represented one of the war's great miscalculations of capability versus reality. The forces at his disposal appeared overwhelming on paper. Luftflotte II under Albert Kesselring, who held the rank of General Feldmarschall, and Luftflotte III under Hugo Sperle's command, with Flieger Corps 8 commanded by Wolfram von Richthofen, containing the specialized Stuka dive bomber units. In aggregate, over 300 bombers and 550 fighters stood ready for operations. The 27th of May marked Operation Dynamo's first full day of large-scale evacuation and the Luftwaffe's concentrated attempt to fulfill Göring's grandiose promise. German squadrons attacked in successive waves from 7 in the morning until darkness fell. Dunkirk harbour was set ablaze, the oil storage tanks creating black smoke columns visible for miles in every direction. Yet the Fliegerkorps II War Diary would record unexpected resistance from RAF Fighter Command. Spitfire and Hurricane aircraft operating from southern England bases engaged German formations with determination that surprised Luftwaffe planners. The Luftwaffe lost 23 aircraft that first day alone. Among those losses were experienced aircrew that could not easily be replaced from training pipelines. The fundamental problem proved to be endurance and range limitations. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E, operating from Belgian bases, possessed barely 10 minutes of combat time over Dunkirk before fuel consumption concerns forced them to return homeward. The Stukas, so devastating when protected by fighter escort, proved vulnerable to modern fighters when their escorts necessarily departed due to fuel constraints. Weather conditions proved equally challenging to German air operations. Of the 9 evacuation days, only approximately 2.5 provided good flying conditions conducive to bombing operations. On the 28th of May, cloud cover and smoke from burning oil installations obscured potential targets. Kesselring protested to Göring that air crews were exhausted after 2 solid weeks of intensive operations without adequate rest. The Luftwaffe's greatest success materialized on the 1st of June when clearing weather allowed maximum effort. 4 destroyers were sunk along with numerous other vessels. Yet by that juncture, the majority of the BEF had already escaped across the Channel. Despite flying 1,882 bombing sorties and 1,997 fighter sorties, the Luftwaffe had failed to prevent the evacuation from proceeding. Joachim Müncheberg, a German pilot flying with Jagdgeschwader 26, flew escort missions throughout the evacuation period. His combat reports note claiming 5 Spitfire kills, including 4 on the 31st of May alone, earning him the Iron Cross First-Class decoration. Yet even this successful ace noted the intensity of British resistance and the operational challenges of operating at maximum range from bases. When German ground forces resumed their advance on the 27th of May, they encountered transformed defensive arrangements. The British had utilised their respite to establish formidable perimeter defences along canal lines. French forces, particularly the First Army, had begun a last stand that would tie down German divisions desperately needed elsewhere for continuing operations. The 18th Corps War Diary describes the 56th Infantry Division advancing through flooded ground toward Dunkirk, suffering heavy casualties from well-positioned defensive fires. The division became combat ineffective and had to be withdrawn from frontline service. Robert Kershaw's research, published in his work Dunkirk 1940, reveals there existed virtually no coherent plan to reduce the pocket systematically. Units attacked piecemeal without proper coordination between formations. Only 5 of 10 German divisions surrounding Dunkirk could operate effectively from dry ground due to deliberate flooding of approaches. The siege of Lille proved particularly costly in terms of resources diverted. 7 German divisions became embroiled in a 4-day battle against 40,000 French defenders who fought with unexpected determination. The garrison finally surrendered on the 31st of May, but their sacrifice had tied down forces that might have made the decisive difference at Dunkirk itself. General Weger, commanding German forces at Lille, noted in his after-action report that French resistance exceeded all expectations based on their performance earlier in the campaign. German artillery observers documented extraordinary scenes unfolding on the beaches through their range-finding equipment. Wehrmacht records describe long lines of men stretching from the dunes into the water itself, maintaining remarkable discipline even under artillery fire. The variety of vessels particularly struck military observers accustomed to conventional military operations. Everything from Royal Navy destroyers to Thames River pleasure steamers, from fishing trawlers to private yachts, participated in the rescue operation. One divisional war diary noted with professional admiration that the enemy maintains remarkable order during evacuation procedures. Small craft shuttle continuously between beach and larger vessels offshore, despite our artillery fire attempting to disrupt operations. The spontaneous mobilization of civilian vessels was completely unexpected by German military planners operating under conventional assumptions. General Ritter von Thoma, whose tanks sat immobilized by orders and unsuitable terrain, later testified he could see directly into Dunkirk through field glasses, watching British rearguard units conduct textbook fighting withdrawals. The professionalism of these supposedly defeated troops impressed even hostile observers. German soldiers' letters preserved in the Bundesarchive reveal complex reactions to witnessing Dunkirk. Initial confidence about imminent British surrender gradually gave way to uncertainty as Britain continued fighting rather than seeking terms. The masses of abandoned equipment, specifically 2,472 artillery pieces, 84,427 vehicles, 657,566 tons of stores and ammunition, according to Wehrmacht tallies, seem to confirm the BEF's destruction as an effective fighting force. Yet Wehrmacht intelligence reports noted growing unease among troops. If defeated armies could escape so successfully, what might defending armies achieve on their home territory? The psychological impact proved particularly acute among units that had suffered unexpected casualties against British rearguard actions. The SS Totenkopf Division's massacre of British prisoners at Le Paradis on the 27th of May and at Wormhout on the 28th of May reflected breakdown of discipline when faced with fiercer resistance than poorly trained units had expected. These war crimes, thoroughly documented in post-war trials, revealed the psychological strain on units encountering determined opposition. Sönke Neitzel's analysis of German prisoner-of-war conversations, secretly recorded by British intelligence services, reveals how deeply Dunkirk affected German military thinking across the board. Veterans consistently described it as the missed opportunity when the war could have been won decisively. Post-war German military studies identified Dunkirk as the point where strategic momentum shifted permanently away from German favour. While Germany would achieve more battlefield victories subsequently, the opportunity for quick, decisive triumph had passed irrevocably. Every subsequent campaign would be fought with Britain actively opposing, organising coalitions, and serving as base for eventual Allied operations. Franz Halder's meticulously maintained diary provides the most detailed contemporary criticism of the Halt order from a professional military perspective. His entry for the 24th of May noted the Supreme Leader was terribly nervous and afraid to take any chances whatsoever. Halder had opposed the halt, believing the Luftwaffe remained dependent upon weather conditions beyond anyone's control. Heinz Guderian's post-war memoir Panzer Leader identified the halt as having the most disastrous influence on the entire war's subsequent course. His bitterness was professional rather than personal. His corps had been within striking distance of Dunkirk when stopped. Rundstedt's position evolved significantly in retrospect. Initially supporting the halt due to legitimate concerns about tank losses and overextended flanks, he later claimed it was entirely the Supreme Leader's decision alone. This claim, unsupported by contemporary evidence from the period, became part of post-war mythology shifting blame to the dead Supreme Leader. Hermann Göring never publicly admitted the halt was an error, but the Luftwaffe's failure permanently damaged his standing and credibility. Internal Luftwaffe assessments highlighted fundamental problems including extreme range, weather dependency, and unexpected RAF effectiveness that planners hadn't anticipated. Kesselring and Richthoven's after-action reports emphasized that their forces were exhausted after 2 solid weeks of intensive operations without rest periods. The Luftwaffe lost between 156 and 240 aircraft during the evacuation period, losses that would be keenly felt during the subsequent Battle of Britain. While attention focused on Dunkirk's beaches, 40,000 French soldiers conducted one of the war's most heroic defensive stands at Lille. For 4 days, they held 7 German divisions, including 3 armoured divisions desperately needed elsewhere. German unit records reveal grudging respect for French tenacity in urban combat. General Weger's forces suffered significant casualties in street fighting for which they were poorly prepared. When the garrison finally surrendered on the 31st of May, German soldiers rendered military honours, a rare gesture reflecting genuine respect for opponents. Churchill later calculated that Lille's defence enabled 100,000 additional evacuations to succeed. German intelligence reports expressed frustration at French defensive tactics employed around the Dunkirk perimeter. Using flooding to maximum advantage, French forces turned approach routes into killing fields where attackers suffered heavily. The 68th Infantry Division beat back repeated German attacks even as the evacuation proceeded offshore. Wehrmacht reports noted French units maintained discipline even after Belgium's surrender on the 28th of May exposed their northern flank to envelopment. German commanders had expected French morale to collapse under these circumstances, but instead found increased determination among defenders. German soldiers advancing into Dunkirk after the 4th of June found extraordinary quantities of abandoned military equipment. Wehrmacht quartermasters catalogued 2,472 artillery pieces, 84,427 vehicles, 657,566 tons of ammunition and stores. Propaganda companies filmed endless footage of captured material for newsreel purposes. This material windfall created false assumptions at higher levels. German leadership, observing such massive equipment losses, assumed Britain was effectively disarmed and incapable of continued resistance. This influenced Operation Sea Lion planning and contributed to underestimating British resilience and capacity for recovery. By the 24th of May, German tank strength had been significantly reduced through combat action and mechanical failure. Panzer III and IV tanks proved less mechanically reliable than expected during sustained operational tempo. Some divisions reported only 50% operational strength in their armoured vehicles. This mechanical reality influenced the Halt decision significantly. With Fall Rot, Case Red, still planned against remaining French forces south of the German penetration, preserving armoured strength became paramount in operational planning. Every tank lost at Dunkirk would be unavailable for the subsequent drive on Paris. Wehrmacht intelligence had calculated that at maximum perhaps 30,000 to 45,000 troops might escape by sea given available shipping. The evacuation of over 330,000 Allied troops was completely outside German planning assumptions and conventional military thinking. German doctrine emphasized Kesselschlacht, cauldron battles where surrounded forces surrendered after supplies were exhausted. The concept of maritime evacuation on this unprecedented scale was outside Wehrmacht experience and doctrinal preparation. The spontaneous mobilization of civilian vessels, the famous little ships, was entirely unexpected by military planners trained in conventional operations. German High Command fundamentally misread Dunkirk's significance for the war's continuation. The Supreme Leader's proclamation on the 5th of June claimed the BEF was destroyed as a fighting force. The abandoned equipment seemed to confirm this assessment. German planning for potentially invading Britain assumed they would face demoralized, poorly equipped forces lacking combat experience. Instead, evacuated troops formed the experienced core around which Britain rebuilt its army with American assistance. The Dunkirk spirit that emerged in Britain proved more powerful than German calculations had anticipated. The Supreme Leader's headquarters at Felsenest, located near Bad Münstereifel, was where the Halt order originated and was transmitted. Staff officers later described the Supreme Leader's mood swings during this period. Initial exhilaration at the breakthrough's success, followed by increasing nervousness as panzers raced ahead without infantry support. Halder documented the Supreme Leader's fear that success had come too easily, that some trap awaited the exposed armoured formations. This paranoia, rooted in personal First World War experience, influenced the crucial decision to halt. The halt order went directly from the supreme leader to frontline units, bypassing normal military channels and chain of command. During the evacuation period, headquarters received increasingly frantic reports about the scale of Allied maritime rescue efforts. Yet the supreme leader seemed unconcerned, convinced Britain would seek peace terms rather than continuing a hopeless fight. This strategic blindness would prove fatal to overall German ambitions. Joseph Goebbels faced the challenge of presenting the escape of hundreds of thousands as German victory for propaganda purposes. German newspapers focused exclusively on territory gained and equipment captured, while minimizing the evacuation's significance entirely. The Völkischer Beobachter proclaimed the greatest annihilation battle of all time in triumphant headlines. Wehrmacht communiques maintained this fiction consistently. The announcement on the 5th of June emphasized prisoners and material captured without mentioning those who escaped across the Channel. This created a significant gap between official propaganda narratives and what frontline soldiers had personally witnessed. The German public initially had no grasp of the evacuation's actual scale or significance. However, soldiers on leave gradually spread word about what they had observed. Secret police reports from summer 1940 reveal growing public concern about continuing war against Britain rather than achieving peace. The Luftwaffe's subsequent defeat in the Battle of Britain and the cancellation of Operation Sea Lion confirmed suspicions that opportunity had been lost at Dunkirk. The failure to destroy the BEF fundamentally altered German invasion planning for Britain. Operation Sea Lion planners had to account for hundreds of thousands of troops they had assumed would be prisoners rather than defending British shores. Admiral Raeder argued logically that if Britain could evacuate forces under fire, they could certainly prevent invasion attempts. The Luftwaffe's failure at Dunkirk raised serious doubts about achieving air superiority necessary for amphibious invasion. Wehrmacht studies identified multiple problems revealed by Dunkirk operations. British ability to mobilise civilian resources, tenacious defensive capabilities despite defeat, and naval superiority in Channel waters. These factors contributed significantly to Sea Lion's eventual cancellation. Dunkirk's ultimate consequence was ensuring Germany would face the two-front war it desperately sought to avoid strategically. By allowing Britain to remain in the war actively, Germany guaranteed eventual American involvement and sustained Western pressure while simultaneously fighting the Soviet Union. German military professionals spent the war's duration analysing the Dunkirk decision in staff studies. They identified it as where strategic momentum shifted permanently against Germany. Every subsequent campaign would face British opposition, organising coalitions against Germany and serving as the base for eventual Allied invasion of Europe. Hans von Luck's reconnaissance battalion in the 7th Panzer Division had led Rommel's thrust through Belgium, reaching the Meuse in 3 days' rapid advance. In his memoir, Panzer Commander, von Luck described the frustration of watching the evacuation while ordered to halt operations. "We could not understand why we let so many get away," von Luck wrote years later. His reconnaissance units, specifically trained to exploit enemy weakness, sat idle while enemy forces escaped. The professional soldier in him recognized this strategic failure even as propaganda proclaimed complete victory. Rommel's after-action report from Arras, preserved in the Bundesarchiv military archives, describes near disaster on the 21st of May. British Matilda tanks had torn through his division's flank, creating panic among support units. Rommel personally directed anti-tank guns, improvising use of 88mm flak guns in ground roll to restore the deteriorating situation. The psychological impact on German command proved significant and lasting. If 2 British battalions could cause such disruption to an armoured division, what might a coordinated counter-offensive achieve? This fear contributed substantially to the cautious halt order. Wehrmacht artillery observers documented the evacuation through their precision range-finding equipment. Unit war diaries described beaches resembling disturbed anthills, with long queues maintaining discipline under harassing fire. The variety of vessels, from warships to pleasure craft, demonstrated British improvisational capacity German planners hadn't anticipated in their calculations. Luftwaffe unit records detail the operational challenges of the Dunkirk operation from the Air Force perspective. Jagdgeschwader 26's war diary notes the severe strain of maximum range operations on pilots and aircraft. Pilots had minimal time over target before fuel consumption forced return to bases. Stuka units reported heavy losses when fighter escort necessarily departed due to fuel constraints. Weather reports from Luftflotte 2 and 3 show poor conditions prevailed for most of the evacuation period, severely limiting operations. Smoke from burning oil storage tanks further obscured targets for bomber formations. Kesselring's protests to Göring about crew exhaustion went unheeded by the Reichsmarschall. Joachim Müncheberg of JG-26 achieved ace status during Dunkirk operations, claiming multiple Spitfire victories in aerial combat. Yet his combat reports note the unexpected intensity of RAF resistance encountered. British fighters appeared in greater numbers than intelligence predictions had indicated. The Luftwaffe's maximum effort on the 1st of June sank several ships but came too late in the evacuation schedule. Most evacuations were already complete by that point. Despite nearly 4,000 sorties flown, the Air Force had failed to deliver on Göring's confident promise to the Supreme Leader. Post-war interviews with German veterans consistently identified Dunkirk as the war's true turning point psychologically. In testimony provided for the United States Army's Historical Division, former Wehrmacht officers described it as the moment when victory slipped away permanently. General Ritter von Thoma, interviewed by military historian Basil Liddell-Hart, stated clearly that he was right out in front near Berges. From there, he could see everything happening in Dunkirk with his own eyes. His frustration at being held back remained evident years later when recounting the experience. Military historians have extensively analysed the Halt order from multiple perspectives. The German official history, Das Deutsche Reich und der Zweite Weltkrieg, identifies multiple contributing factors including tank losses, stretched supply lines, the Supreme Leader's nervousness, and Göring's confident assurances. Modern analysis emphasises that the Halt order, while significant, was not the sole factor in the evacuation's success. French resistance, British determination, and German exhaustion all contributed to the final outcome. The Dunkirk experience fundamentally affected German military doctrine going forward. The failure to prevent maritime evacuation led to increased emphasis on coastal defence and anti-shipping capabilities in doctrine. However, these lessons came too late to affect the war's ultimate outcome. Wehrmacht staff studies from 1941 through 1945 repeatedly cited Dunkirk as demonstrating the danger of incomplete victory. The escape of defeated armies to fight another day challenged fundamental German concepts of decisive battle. The German perspective on Dunkirk must account for the human cost of the entire French campaign. German forces suffered between 120,000 and 160,000 casualties during the Battle of France, a relatively light toll for such comprehensive victory, but one that included significant losses around Dunkirk itself. The evacuation statistics tell their own compelling story. British forces evacuated totaled 338,226 personnel. French and Belgian forces evacuated numbered 139,997. German prisoners captured at Dunkirk amounted to approximately 40,000. Luftwaffe aircraft lost ranged from 156 to 240. German equipment captured was minimal, but tactical advantage lost proved incalculable. These numbers represented a peculiar form of victory, tactical success with strategic implications that would prove disastrous. The Halt order remains one of military history's most intensively studied command decisions. Multiple factors contributed, including mechanical limitations of equipment, supply concerns, command caution, inter-service rivalry, and fundamental misunderstanding of enemy capabilities and will. German military education after the war's conclusion used Dunkirk as a case study in the dangers of incomplete victory. The Wehrmacht's own analysis concluded that political interference, inter-service rivalry, and failure to understand enemy psychology had transformed tactical triumph into eventual strategic defeat. From the German perspective, Dunkirk represents history's most paradoxical military outcome: overwhelming tactical success that contained the seeds of strategic catastrophe. The Wehrmacht achieved everything military professionals thought possible through their training and doctrine. Breakthrough, encirclement, and pursuit to the sea accomplished in mere weeks. They shattered Allied armies, captured vast territories, and stood on the brink of ending the Western War completely. Yet at the crucial moment, through a combination of command hesitation, inter-service rivalry, and fundamental misunderstanding of their enemy's resolve and capacity, they allowed the core of future Allied victory to escape across the Channel. The Halt Order of the 24th through 26th of May 1940 stands as one of the most consequential military decisions in modern history's record. Had the panzers been permitted to advance, had Guderian been allowed to close the trap completely, had the Luftwaffe successfully prevented maritime evacuation, the war's entire course might have changed fundamentally. The German soldiers who watched the evacuation witnessed, without fully comprehending in the moment, when quick victory transformed into protracted defeat. They had achieved battlefield success while failing strategically, the very definition of Pyrrhic victory. The German accounts of Dunkirk, meticulously preserved in war diaries, official reports, and post-war testimonies, provide essential perspective on how military excellence can coexist with strategic blindness at the highest levels. The Wehrmacht demonstrated tactical brilliance while failing to grasp war's political dimensions beyond battlefield operations. They won battles while losing the broader conflict, achieved operational success while ensuring strategic defeat. For the German soldiers who stood on Dunkirk's perimeter in late May and early June 1940, the future remained unknowable and uncertain. They saw abandoned equipment scattered across beaches, fleeing enemies boarding vessels, and confirmation of German military superiority over Allied forces. They could not foresee that the miracle of their rapid victory would be overshadowed by the miracle of Allied escape, that the soldiers boarding those miscellaneous vessels would return 4 years later as liberators and conquerors of German territory. The German perspective on Dunkirk ultimately reveals the complexity of military victory and defeat in modern warfare. It was simultaneously their greatest triumph and most catastrophic failure, proof of tactical superiority and strategic myopia combined. The beaches where German soldiers once stood watching their enemies escape became the symbol of opportunity lost forever, of victory incomplete, of the moment when the war's outcome, though not yet determined, began its inexorable shift away from German success toward eventual defeat. Today, when the last witnesses have passed into history, we are left with their testimonies and records, a reminder that military events must be understood from multiple perspectives for complete understanding. The German view of Dunkirk shows us that victory and defeat are rarely absolute in war, that tactical success without strategic wisdom proves hollow ultimately, and that moral dimensions of warfare often outweigh purely military considerations. The German tragedy at Dunkirk was not that they failed militarily by conventional measures. By every standard battlefield metric, they had succeeded brilliantly in defeating Allied armies. Their tragedy lay in the failure to understand that wars are won not merely through battlefield success alone, but through breaking an enemy's will to resist completely. At Dunkirk, they destroyed an army's equipment while inadvertently strengthening a nation's resolve to continue fighting. The evacuation that German soldiers watched with such mounting frustration became the foundation of British resistance, the seedbed of the special relationship with America that would prove decisive, and ultimately the launching point for liberation of Europe. For Germany, Dunkirk marked both the apex of military achievement and the beginning of inevitable decline toward defeat. The panzer commanders who sat idle by the AA Canal, the Luftwaffe pilots who failed to stop the ships despite maximum effort, the infantry who watched the beaches gradually empty of enemy soldiers, all were unwitting participants in one of history's great turning points. They had won everything except what mattered most strategically, the chance to end the war before it consumed their nation and continent in total destruction. This, then, is the German perspective on Dunkirk, a masterpiece of military operational art that failed strategically. A victory that ensured ultimate defeat, a moment of triumph that guaranteed eventual tragedy. The voices of German participants remind us that Dunkirk was not simply British deliverance, but German disaster. Not just an evacuation, but an evaporation of strategic opportunity that would never return. The Wehrmacht forces that departed Dunkirk in June 1940 left behind more than empty beaches and abandoned equipment scattered across sand. They left behind their best chance for quick victory, for limited war, for avoiding the catastrophe that would engulf Germany and Europe in total war. Their accounts, preserved in archives and memories, ensure that the German perspective on Dunkirk remains part of our complete understanding, a cautionary tale about the limits of military power alone and the dangers of incomplete victory when opportunity presents itself. In the end, the German experience at Dunkirk teaches us that military history is never simple or straightforward, that victory and defeat intertwine in complex ways beyond battlefield results, and that consequences of command decisions echo far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The German soldiers who witnessed the evacuation earned a peculiar place in history as victors who enabled their own ultimate defeat, conquerors who opened the door to their own eventual conquest, witnesses to the moment when tactical brilliance collided with strategic blindness at the highest levels of command. Their story deserves remembrance not to glorify Wehrmacht achievements or excuse aggressive warfare, but to understand the full complexity of one of history's most consequential military operations from all perspectives. The German perspective on Dunkirk reminds us that every triumph potentially contains the seeds of disaster, that military success without political wisdom proves futile ultimately, and that understanding the past requires examining events through multiple lenses rather than single narratives. The beaches of Dunkirk, where German soldiers once stood in frustration watching their enemies escape across the water, remain a monument to the paradoxes of warfare. For Britain, they represent deliverance and determination in the face of defeat. For France, they symbolize both sacrifice and feelings of abandonment. And for Germany, they stand as eternal testimony to the victory that slipped away at the crucial moment, the triumph that became tragedy, the precise moment when winning the battle meant losing the war.